I'm Jan Hofer from Trier University in Germany, and my colleague Athanasios Chasiotis from Tilburg University in the Netherlands. We have the pleasure to present a keynote on implicit motives. And the title of the keynote is When a Picture Story is Worth More Than 1,000 Responses, Implicit Motives Across Cultures. Before we start with the talk, we would like to thank all our collaborators. We cannot personally introduce all of you and your valuable contributions, but without your help, the research during the last almost 20 years would not have been possible. Thank you again for all your engagement, knowledge, and also for your hospitality. We also would like to thank the agencies for funding our research in the past and hope that they will do so in future. Before we start with the talk, we would like to do a little kind of experiment. Just imagine we were asked by the Congress Committee to spontaneously write an introduction to the talk, and we would come up with one of the following introductions. A part of you would be introduced to the talk by the first, another part by the second, and the last group by the third intro. I go quickly through the introductions. When we got the invitation for the keynote, we were delighted because the keynote is a wonderful opportunity to present our unique findings and achievements on effects of implicit motives in diverse cultural contexts. Immediately, we concentrated on the task to prepare a fine presentation. And we guess that we came up with a nice result. We even might win the prize for the best talk. We hope that you will enjoy the following 60 minutes and that we will not disappoint your high expectations. Let's move to the second one. We were delighted because the keynote is a wonderful opportunity to get in touch with dear colleagues. It was frustrating to learn that the Congress will be held online due to the pandemic, as we were looking forward to personally meet our friends and colleagues in Olomouc, not seen for quite a while. However, we enjoyed the time when we were mutually working on the talk. We had so much fun. We hope that you're fine and will enjoy the following talk. And the last one, we were delighted because the keynote is something special. And we felt really honored to be asked for. It is also a wonderful opportunity to spread our ideas and to affect people thinking on determinants of human behavior across cultural contexts. We hope that we can catch your full attention and that you will remember some of our notions when planning future studies. Enjoy the following talk. Wouldn't you get quite different impressions about us, about our motives and our personalities in general? Just have that introductions in mind. We will come back to that later. Let's come to the overview of what you will hear the next approximately 60 minutes. Researchers produced impressive evidence that implicit motives represent a fundamental source to explain individuals' behavior and psychological processes. Yet still today, little cross-cultural research is available. And this is unfortunate, as implicit motives are considered a basic and universal component of humans' personality. In the first part of this keynote, we distinguish self-attributed from implicit motives, the two types of motives that are typically used to explain individuals' behavior and mental processes. So thereafter, I will briefly touch pros and cons of early research on implicit motives in diverse cultural contexts. Although early pioneering work pointed to culture-specific but also universal aspects of implicit motives, the meaningfulness of those findings is difficult to evaluate, as research might have been flawed due to the neglect of methodological issues, such as the problem of measurement equivalence. Given such misgivings, we will outline recent methodological advancements in measuring implicit motives. In the second part, given by Atta, contemporary examples of bias-free cross-cultural research on implicit motives will be presented, focusing on studies on motive development and motive congruence, but also on the role of implicit motives for the solution of developmental tasks, exemplified by generativity, and for pro-social behavior in general. We will end the talk with a brief outlook on things still to do in research on implicit motives across cultural groups. In psychology, or personality psychology, at least three major elements that universally affect and shape an individual's mental processes, social behavior, and life adaptations are distinguished. We have traits and temperament. These are relatively stable. But second, we have cognitions such as attitudes, beliefs, goals, and values. And finally, there are implicit motives. Unfortunately, these different components of personality have led basically separate lives with little opportunity for stimulating exchange. And this, in our view, is particularly true for implicit motives that have long been neglected in research on human functioning and behavior. So let's turn to the core topic of our talk, implicit motives or implicit motivation. And when you are asked what energizes, selects, and guides human behavior and thus a given direction to the development of an individual, scholars will give different answers to these questions. Whether we have access to the motives that push or pull us to act in a specific way or not, and thus whether motives or motivation is an explicit or implicit phenomenon, or maybe both. We come back to that a little later. While research on implicit motivational processes that are difficult to access by introspection has been very popular at the beginning, it has clearly abated since the 50s or 60s in the last century. The conception of motivation as implicit has more and more frequently been ignored in favor of an almost entirely self-report-based approach in theorizing and empirical research on motivation. Such cognitive models of motivation became very popular in the course of the so-called cognitive revolution. Yet, the rejection of this implicit component of personality is premature, because implicit motives predict important mental processes and are a decisive determinant of developmental pathways and long-term behavioral trends. Happily, recent years have witnessed a renewed interest in non-conscious aspects of cognition, emotion, and behavior that help to explain the complex pattern of human functioning. Maybe also driven by the sometimes insufficient ecological validity of self-report measurements, it has become increasingly evident that experiences, thoughts, and actions can be influenced by mental contents such as percepts, memories, thoughts, feelings, and desires, or some event in the current stimulus environment of which we are unaware. Empirical research is rediscovering the fact that unconscious psychological forces can have profound effects on our behavior. Also, the development of a comprehensive theoretical framework by McLellan and colleagues was a big step forward to overcome the fragmentation within the field of social motivation. This model offers a promising integration of diverse findings, concepts, and theories by considering biological, learned, and cognitive components of motivation. McLellan and his associates propose that goal-directed behavior is caused by two types of different motives, namely implicit motives and explicit or self-attributed motives. They argue that implicit and explicit motives are acquired and shaped at different times in ontogenesis, are linked to different classes of behavior, and crucially, must be assessed by different methods. And this you can see in the table. You see the differences between implicit and explicit motives in the time of development, in learning processes, in the representation and realization, and then to which behavior they are linked, and finally, in the type of measurements used to assess implicit and explicit motives. Most research on implicit motives is done on the so-called big three of motivation. There might be other motives, but there's wide agreement among scholars that these three motives underlie most of human strivings and behavioral acts. And these motives are the need for achievement, the need for affiliation, and the need for power. And the core of each of these motives is it to gain positive affective experiences associated with motive satisfaction and to avoid negative effects when motives are frustrated. And as you see, the incentive for the implicit achievement motive is mastery of challenging tasks or to do something better. For the need for affiliation, it is the establishment or maintaining of relationships with others or feelings to be close to others. And the core of the need for power is to have impact on others' behavior and emotions. And you also see in the table the negative incentives, and these are fear, rejection, loneliness, and to be dominated by others. In other words, implicit motives cover questions like, where do I feel well and where do I experience certain kind of emotions? In contrast, explicit motives relate to an individual's self-concept and answer questions like, who am I and what do others expect of me? Both systems might be aligned to each other, or what is often the case, not. For example, persons may describe themselves as being ambitious and achievement-oriented, but deep inside they do not enjoy difficult tasks and challenges. Atta will focus on this topic in the second part of the keynote. As outlined in the table on differences between implicit and explicit motives, implicit motives are revealed in people's spontaneous behavior and in their fantasy. Thus, you can code lots of material for motives, such as speeches, newspaper articles, even school books, or on the individual level, fantasy stories. But now let's come back to the preliminary example, or the little experiment. You remember the three divergent introductions. And if we would code the introductions according to David Winter's well-established manual for scoring implicit motives, the first introduction is full of achievement-related indicators. There are references to unique accomplishments, to do things good or better, reaching a standard of excellence, but also the fear to fail in achievements. In contrast, the second one is concerned with affiliation, with friendship, negative feelings because of problems in initiating or maintaining relationships, and there are mentioned affiliation-oriented activities and a concern for the welfare of others. And finally, the last one offers hints at the speaker's power motives by including references to fame and status and a concern for the influence on other people's thinking and behavior. And that is how implicit motives work. They affect our spontaneous behavior and are realized by other people by things we do or things we don't do. And you can measure other people's implicit motives at a distance from their behavior. And that is what David Winter in his work on implicit motives of presidents of the US has done, for example. If you're interested in this exciting line of research, and if you would like to learn about the similarities of Donald Trump and the last German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, I refer you to the fascinating work of David. Okay, but let's come back to the methods typically used in research at the individual level. Here, first, we have the classic approach, the picture story exercise. Based on the classical thematic apperception test developed by Morgan Murray almost 90 years ago. And when doing the PSE, people are asked to write a brief story to a variety of picture or verbal stimuli. And the stories are subsequently coded for motive imagery, which reflects the strength of the big three. Not focusing particularly on motive strengths, but also on modes of motive realization, the OMT, the operant motive test or the operant multi-motive test, has the advantage that participants do not have to write a complete story, but briefly have to answer 3, sometimes the last question is omitted, or 4 questions. While the first answer typically reflects the motive, the next questions are used to code the mode of motive realization. And both instruments have shown to be valid methods for the assessment of motives in diverse cultural groups. Let's move to the next chapter of the talk, to early cultural studies on implicit motives, and above all to recent progress in the measurement of implicit motives across cultural contexts. Until the mid-60s in the last century, the use of thematic perception methods was popular in cultural and cross-cultural research, investigating the national character or various facets of personality like attitudes, values, and the role behavior. It was often assumed that these methods obviate problems of self-report, such as participants' unwillingness or inability to give relevant information and true attitudes, or fear of social disapproval. Cross-cultural studies on implicit motives were probably set off by the groundbreaking work of McClelland and colleagues on the need for achievement. So it seems barely surprising that most work on motivation in different cultural contexts focused on achievement. In principle, 2 lines of research are distinguishable: the assessment of implicit motives at the collective and at the individual level. At the collective level, McClelland and his associates used the innovative method of content coding, folktales, literature, children's readers, and artistic expression to measure the level of implicit motives of a certain cultural group at a certain period of time in their history. Stories read by children in public schools were chosen as material indicative of collective achievement concern because of their comparability across countries in story length, imaginativeness, and in the extent to which stories were relatively uninfluenced by historical events. Furthermore, it was assumed that material which educational authorities think is right for children to read in school may well represent the basic motivational ideas or spirit of the times in a country. The measured national level of, for example, achievement was then related to various social to cultural outcomes indicative of economic growth or decline in the following decades. Another focus of research on collective level scores of motives highlighted developmental issues of implicit needs, in particular socialization practices associated with the formation of the need for achievement. Early research on implicit motives across cultures at the individual level is more difficult to evaluate, as concerted research efforts were rarely present. As with research on the collective level, most research focused on antecedents and correlates of the need for achievement. There are some pros and cons of early work on implicit motives. Let's come to the pros. Several studies have shown statistically significant differences in the need for achievement between groups of individuals drawn from culturally divergent groups and societies. It is very likely that genuine differences in need for achievement were reported by those studies that linked its finding on motive strengths meaningfully to, for example, antecedents of motives formation, such as dominant child-rearing practices, thus considering the motive's nomological network. On the other side, the findings on cross-cultural differences or similarities in motive strengths with culturally divergent samples seem to be more problematic, as methodological flaws cannot be ruled out. Similarly, sporadic early research across cultures, focusing on needs for power and affiliation, must await methodologically sophisticated replications before a comprehensive evaluation of these research efforts may be attempted. Thus, already in the 1960s, Lindsay argued that these studies often might be seriously biased. And here we started our work some years ago, And in our aim to develop bias-free methods to assess implicit motives across cultural groups, I guess Atta and myself, probably like many others of us, were very much influenced by the work of our dear colleagues Fons van der Feve and Kwok Leung, who are deeply missed by many of us. In their classic book, Methods and Data Analysis for Cross-Cultural Research, they describe different levels of measurement equivalence and associated sources of bias, namely construct bias, method bias, and item bias. And these sources of bias have different origin. Construct bias, for example, occurs when culture-bound meaning and or behavioral indicators of constructs are present. The method bias can be subdivided into the sample, instrument, and administration bias here. So it's concerned with methodological procedural aspects of cross-cultural research. And finally, item bias refers to characteristics of single test items or pictures. And as you know, these different sources of bias have consequences how we can use the data. If we can use it at all for cross-cultural comparisons, or if we have to be careful when, for example, comparing means and relationships between constructs. Related to implicit motives research, construct bias is reflected, for example, by indigenous facets of the need for achievement. For example, a number of studies report a so-called socially oriented nature of the need for achievement in non-Western cultures. Second, there's a risk of method bias. This source of bias is not exclusively related to the assessment of implicit motives, but reflects problems generally related to the assessment procedure, such as sample differences in knowledge of test language, then in their familiarity with test methods, or received test instructions. And finally, there's item bias, and this refers to the adequacy of single cues selected for motive assessment. I will just briefly mention what we did to control for sources of bias in our research. Let's come first to the construct bias. We were not aiming to develop indigenous measures, as those measures do not allow cross-cultural comparisons. Rather, we collaborated with local cultural experts and tested the cultural fit of construct definitions and coding manuals in pre-tests. With respect to method bias, we secured the recruitment of balanced samples and implemented standardized assessment procedures as far as possible. However, we also adapted assessment instructions to make, above all, participants in non-Western cultural contexts more familiar with test methods. And finally, with respect to item or picture cues, we followed two approaches. First, we identified the relevant picture cues for motive assessment in collaboration with local experts. And second, after data assessment, statistical tools were implemented to identify and exclude biased items before analyzing study hypotheses. Here are a few examples of picture cues used in research on implicit motives. Early researchers aim to develop picture sets that are closely adapted to the cultural ethnic background of participants. See in the top right, for example. Here, new pictures were developed that were assumed to reflect the context of participants, or pictures typically used in Western contexts were adapted. It was hypothesized that an ethnically inclusive PSE would enhance the narratives of respondents. Our own findings, but also findings reported by Scott 2008, do not allow the conclusion that it is necessary to culturally adapt picture cues. Rather, picture sets used in cross-cultural research ought to depict relevant context and should be screened for including culture-specific cues. For example, the picture trapeze artists, that is typically used in Western cultural contexts, may not be suitable to assess motives in cultural contexts where this is an unknown situation. For example, I remember the stories wrote by Zambian adolescents. They do not write about artists in a circus. They wrote about witches flying through the air. Another example is the architect at the desk. It has a strong pull for affiliation in Western contexts. You see the little picture at the desk depicting a family. Among non-Western participants from sub-Saharan Africa, this little detail is often overlooked, and the picture has a strong pull for achievement. You see the white collars, Caucasian situation. And the final example refers to the couple by a bridge, also a picture typically used in research with Euro-American samples. It has a strong pull for affiliation in Western groups, but additionally, we found a moderate pull for achievement in non-Western groups. So many stories focused on the well-designed bridge. What we did in research, we omitted the bridge. And you see now the couple is sitting at the sea. Thus, cues ought to be seriously screened for suitability to arouse certain emotives in diverse cultural contexts. And that's the end of the first part. Many thanks for your attention. And Atta, please, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you, Jan, for the first part. I will now continue with empirical results on implicit motives. And before we start, I would like to say something about the theory-guided selection of the research sites, which has to do with our theoretical background, that we are interested also in universals. And from our perspective, cross-cultural psychology appears to be a mainly difference-driven. So as we have the quote here, what we mean by that is that we are more interested in similarities and differences and not in differences alone. And there is a certain implicit bias towards differences. That's why the research objective was to examine universal patterns among psychological constructs. And that's why we needed a selection of cultural samples that are as different as possible. We have here the cultural samples in a table. I won't delve into that, not in too much detail. I also won't do that in many other slides because you are also free to look them up after my talk when they will be available. So what you can see here at a first glance and in a brief glance is that we try to have a variance regarding crucial parameters on cultural differences so that we could be sure, as Jan already introduced in the first part, that we have a culturally informed set of instruments which is working in different and diverse areas around the world. So first I will give you some brief empirical results on the development of motives. It will be a selection anyway with our with the results I will present. So I will only focus now on one a developmental study we did on the development of motives. It's a lack of research in the search for the development of implicit motivation. And this is really an interesting area for future research. We did one regarding the behavioral correlates of the big three. This is a reprise of what Jan already has shown in the first part. What's important to add here to the table you already saw is that we focus on the behavioral correlates as an outcome of implicit motivation, and mainly on pro-social behavior in the power domain. So what you can see here is the behavioral correlates of power as an example, that there can be career advancement, to be a manager, to be a leader. Prestige can be part of the motivation as a behavioral outcome, and exploitative behavior, but also pro-social behavior. And this is something which has also to do with the dual nature of power. We often have, as a layperson, a more negative view on power, but according to motivation psychology, power has also positive sides. For example, that you care about people, that you want to help them, that you want to support them. That's why pro-social behavior, according to that definition, can be a behavioral correlate of implicit power motivation. So that's also one of the background statements we need to have in mind regarding the results. But let's now go to the developmental study we did in 2010, where we compared Cameroonian and German preschoolers regarding their implicit motivation. We had a modified child OMT measure for implicit motivation. And we also measured autobiographical memory and false belief understanding. And first of all, we identified two different motive realizations in children, where we also found intercultural differences between the Cameroonian and the German sample, namely that the interdependent motive realization was more pronounced in the German sample, and this also has connections to the false belief understanding and the autobiographical memory. To put the results in a nutshell is that the differentiations in narratives in the autobiographical memory correlates with the independent implicit motive orientation and with theory of mind, which means that autobiographical memory in the preschool years seems to mediate the relationship between theory of mind understanding and implicit motive orientation. So this is one of the few or almost only study until now where we have a first glimpse on the connections between autobiographical memory on the one hand and theory of mind on the other. But there's still a lot of work to be done to see how these motive developments occurs during, emerges and occurs during the preschool years. Then we come to motive congruence as one of the dominant fields also in implicit motivation, as Jan already gave an example of how it can be connected. So the relationship between the implicit part of motivation and the explicit part of motivation can be regarded in at least two different ways, namely that if you are implicitly motivated, for example, to be affiliation motivated or to be a leader, so power motivated, the explicit motivation regarding affiliation can be, for example, that you say that you strive for a career, but this in the end is incongruent with your implicit motivation of being more affiliation motivated. And this can cause also trouble regarding your psychological functioning, as we will see in a moment. Regarding the leadership implicit motivation, and if you are also explicitly striving to be a leader, then you are congruent. And then the idea is that you are happier if the explicit motivation, that's what you state and what you are aware of, is in line with what you feel and represent implicitly. Then you are happier than if the explicit motivation does not correlate or is not consistent with your implicit motivation. So the consequences of motive congruence, incongruence in a nutshell is that you have less satisfaction upon goal progress. There is impairment of subjective well-being and life satisfaction. You can show psychosomatic symptoms. There also correlates with depression. There are impairments of self-regulation, and there is also a less flow experience. These are all well-known effects of motive congruence, but not across cultures. So what we did, and one of the pioneering work regarding our research on implicit motives across cultures, is that we demonstrated in the end repeatedly that motive incongruence effects on life satisfaction, for example, seem to be universal. So we could demonstrate in many different samples that motive congruence leads to higher levels of life satisfaction. So let's look at the explicit motives at the beginning. So explicit motives can give meaning and direction to life, and the commitment to And the successful pursuit of goals can also help you to have higher life satisfaction, emotional well-being, less depressive symptoms, and also higher levels of happiness. So that's on the explicit level. But what we found is that this relationship can be moderated by implicit motivation. So in the domains of achievement, affiliation, and power, we found that the interaction of the implicit corresponding motive with the explicit goals can moderate the effect it has on life satisfaction. So to put it, I will show you it in an example of the first study we did. So the hypothesis was that the congruence between explicit life goals and implicit motives will go along with higher levels of life satisfaction. And the results were that motive goal congruence in the domains of affiliation and achievement are significantly related to higher levels of satisfaction with life. So if you have strong affiliation and intimacy goals, the higher the implicit need for affiliation, the higher is the satisfaction with life. And if you have weak affiliation, intimacy goals, is the lower the implicit need for affiliation, the lower the satisfaction with life. So the interplay of explicit and implicit intimacy or achievement motivation in this case is a better predictor for life satisfaction than the main effect of the explicit motivation you can get through self-reports alone. This is one of the reasons why we decided to have the title of this keynote like that. So this is a second example where we did the same in a larger samples, in a larger set of samples from Cameroon, Costa Rica, and Germany. And there you can see that the level of life satisfaction and its relationship to the association of implicit and explicit affiliation motivation is similar across 3 cultures, so that the higher both aspects of motivation are, so the dual system of motivation again, the higher is also life satisfaction. Then we come to the case of generativity. This is the concern for establishing and guiding the next generation and the desire to invest one's substance in forms of life and work that will outlive the self. There are many, outlive the self. There are many different aspects you can count as being generative, for example, upbringing of biological children, but also care for other children. Also the transmission of skills and knowledge as a teacher, for example, or the transmission of cultural values. This is all an overarching, the overarching concept of it would be generativity. And we found in a also cross-cultural a set of samples that we could verify the cross-cultural applicability of the model of McAdams and de Saint-Aubin regarding generativity and the measures of implicit pro-social power motivation in interplay with cultural expectations are predictive for generative concern, and in the end also for generative behavior across 3 different cultural samples from Cameroon, Costa Rica, and Germany. Now we come to the case of implicit pro-social power motivation, because we will delve a bit more into that, because we have a huge set of findings regarding that interesting aspect of power motivation. First of all, I would like to give you the connection to parenting and pro-social power motivation. So we can use the motivation for parenthood as an example of how you can use the implicit motivation to predict behavioral correlates which are related to biological outcomes like having children or becoming a parent. And we considered interactions with younger siblings to measure that. The idea was that the baby faceness, the famous Kintian schema Lawrence already postulated 1943, is helping to develop an implicit motivation for pro-social caring behavior. So if you are in interaction with individuals which show baby faceness, your implicit motivation to develop a caring motivation will be higher. That was the idea. And that's why we also measured the implicit, the number of siblings, of younger siblings you have in a certain family you are in. And this is how we measure the childhood context variables of implicit pro-social power motivation. This is one example of the OMT picture set. There they say she guides the younger ones as the most important thing, and she's patient. And why does the person feel this way? Because as the older one, she has to guide the younger ones. And we came to the idea that this sounds a bit as if you are the older sibling, and then we wanted to know if this idea to interpret a picture like that according to the implicit pro-social power motivation might be related to the fact that you have younger siblings or that you are an older sibling. And we found that it is related to that. And we come up with this idea then to test the developmental pathway to parenthood. And the idea was that the interaction with younger siblings in childhood would foster the development of an implicit caregiving motivation, which in turn leads to an explicit love for children in adulthood. And this will ultimately predict parenthood in Germany, Cameroon, and Costa Rica. And we found out that psychological mechanisms leading to parenthood are equivalent for men and women and across cultures. And the idea here is that implicit caregiving motivation is the missing link between the childhood context of younger siblings and the love for children, which finally leads to parenthood. So there is no direct correlation between younger siblings and love for children. But if you include implicit caregiving motivation, this leads to the idea that the existence of younger siblings can have an impact on the fact if you become a parent later. So this is actually a psychological or motivational psychological explanation or further elaboration of the demographic correlation. We already know that there is a certain correlation between the amount of siblings you have and the amount of children you will have. But this is, of course, a more sociological or demographic correlation. And this is one way to find out how this psychologically could work. So that the idea is here that if you interact with younger siblings in a young age, this is more likely that you will develop implicit caregiving motivation. And this implicit caregiving motivation is related to the explicit love for children, which finally is related to parenthood. The last one is, of course, a bit trivial, but what's also interesting is that this implicit caregiving motivation does not show any gender differences, although love for children, as we would expect from social desirability and gender stereotyping, women score higher than males on that scale, but not regarding implicit caregiving motivation. And what's also interesting is that it's not important which cultural group you look at. So, and also the gender is not important regarding that pathway. You can identify that pathway independent of culture and gender. So it doesn't matter if you have Cameroonian males or German females, the pathway is stable regarding that. So we replicated that the impact of number of siblings to implicit pro-social motivation in many different studies which followed the one we did, the pioneering study I just showed you in 2006, which means that the amount of implicit pro-social motivation of an individual is more related to contextual variables like number of siblings and paternal SES than to the cultural origin of the individuals. So it's more important to know if you come from a family which was not wealthy and had many siblings than to know if that person is from Cameroon or from Hong Kong or from the US. And that's, I think, from a developmental perspective, a really interesting result. which means that you need to know the family context of an individual, which might be more interesting regarding the psychological outcome of this individual as an adult than the cultural origin of that person. Okay, now we come to another set of findings regarding prosocial motivation, which is related to helping. I have to be a bit quicker now. So the hypothesis was that planned helping is more strongly driven by conscious cognition, and therefore explicit prosocial motivation should be a sufficient motivational antecedent of planned helping regardless of implicit prosocial motivation. So what you see here is that independent if implicit motivation is high or low, if explicit motivation is high, it's more likely to show planned help, and if it's low, it's less likely, no matter, and it doesn't really matter what the implicit motivation is. Yes, the amount of implicit motivation. But spontaneous help requires immediate responses with much consideration, without much consideration, and is therefore more likely to be driven also by implicit automatic processes. And then, in this case, the effect of explicit prosocial motivation on spontaneous help should be moderated by implicit motivation. So, explicit prosocial motivation should only lead to spontaneous help when implicit motivation is also high, but not when implicit motivation is low. And this is exactly what we found in 3 studies, that spontaneous help is actually the effect of explicit motivation on spontaneous help is moderated by implicit motivation, but not regarding planned helping. I will have to skip that. You can take a look at it. I think it's also self-explanatory. These were the dependent variables. We made 3 studies on them. And the result is what I just said, that we could find with 3 different outcome variables. So real life helping, self-reported helping, and spontaneous helping and volunteering, that planned helping is independent of implicit prosocial motivation, but spontaneous helping also depends on the moderating effect of implicit prosocial motivation. So implicit prosocial motivation is more predictive for spontaneous helping than for planned helping, which I think is really an interesting result regarding the motivational underpinnings of prosocial behavior. So that's a difference if you want to predict planned helping or spontaneous helping, where you need the dual system of motivation to do that in a proper manner. Another interesting finding regarding this aspect of prosocial power motivation is the role of parenthood. We took parenthood because it's one of the most significant turning points in life, and there are also links between implicit prosociality, parenthood, and generativity. As we indirectly already showed, that it is related with implicit prosocial power motivation, and we wanted to replicate once more if there is again this connection with parenthood and implicit prosocial power motivation. And we wanted to know how volunteering and implicit power motivation is related to parenthood. So the hypotheses were that there are universal developments of implicit and explicit power motivation, that implicit power motivation is related positively to the number of younger siblings. We could replicate that. That explicit power motivation is more related to prosocial norms of close others, and also more related to social desirability, while the motives to volunteer can be a function of parenthood, so that parents volunteering is more related to implicit motivation, while non-parents volunteering is more related to explicit prosocial motivation. And this is exactly what we found in Turkish and US American parents. The motivation for volunteering is more implicit for parents than for non-parents. So the explicit prosocial motivation is more predictive for volunteering if you're not a parent, while you're more likely to be a volunteer if you're a parent than the implicit, if your implicit prosocial motivation is higher. Okay, so Beyond cultural context and age, parenthood can moderate the effect of motivational antecedents of volunteering, and that parents volunteering was more related to implicit pro-social motivation, while non-parents volunteering was more related to explicit pro-social motivation. I skipped that. Okay, this is one summary of what I just described in a bit more detail. So we have different antecedents, mainly 2 childhood SES and the number of siblings, and we could replicate them repeatedly that they have an impact on the amount of implicit pro-social motivation. Of course, this is not a developmental relationship we found here, but it would be interesting, of course, to trace it also longitudinally. But what we can say is that retrospectively, these antecedents have an impact on implicit pro-social power motivation. And we could also show that this implicit measure has multiple outcomes on parenthood, on generativity, on helping, and on volunteering. So now we come to the overall conclusion. There are at least methodological consequences on sample selection, study design, and instruments when we found out that childhood context variables can have an influence on outcome variables which are interesting in the cross-cultural domain, so you should control for them. Number of siblings and parental SES are influential childhood context variables. Control or investigate them, of course. Childhood context effects are different from ecological or economic determinism. So this is also an interesting side result. We have that the parental SES is more predictive for your values you have, for example, as an adult than your own economic situation. And the idea behind that is, I don't want to delve into that, so that there seem to be sensitive periods in early and pre-pubertal childhood where we get more or less prepared to what to expect from our environment we grow up in. And so that there are ontogenetic age-dependent influences of these childhood context effects. So there are still promising, these are still promising developments, but fundamental work still needs to be done. As I already said, there are developmental antecedents of motives and behavioral correlates. For example, we have the finding that implicit motivation in preschoolers is related to significant social cognitive abilities like mentalistic understanding, and to culture-specific self-construal. So there is a lot of work to be done to find out how these interesting milestones in the development of children develop cross-culturally, and also under consideration of implicit motivation. So the take-home message overall, we think, is that if we are able to do a better job at predicting behavior, both across and within social groups, we need to supplement our typical reliance on explicit measures with implicit measures of motivation, beliefs, and values. And I hope that Jan and I could give you some good arguments why we think that way. And I hope that you can join us in this interesting endeavor and fascinating endeavor in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.